The cold metal of the zipper slid up her spine, a harsh contrast to the delicate silk. She smiled, expecting her fiancé's familiar touch. Instead, a voice dipped in gravel and dark promises brushed against her ear. "Your groom's not coming, little dove. I am." The penthouse suite of the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue smelled of crushed white roses, expensive hairspray, and impending doom. Diana Hastings stood before the floor-to-ceiling antique mirror, her reflection a portrait of high society perfection. She was draped in a custom Oscar de la Renta gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk and intricate French lace that cost more than most Manhattan apartments. Pinned into her sophisticated chignon was a vintage Cartier diamond tiara, a family heirloom that felt heavier by the minute. Outside the suite, the muffled hum of 300 elite guests filling the grand ballroom vibrated through the floorboards. Wall Street tycoons, senators, and old-money matriarchs were sipping Dom Perignon, waiting for the wedding of the decade. The union of Diana Hastings, heiress to Hastings Global Shipping, and Dylan Pendleton, the golden boy of Manhattan's most aggressive hedge fund, was supposed to be a flawless merger of legacy and capital. But it was 20:15 p.m. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock sharp, and Dylan was nowhere to be found. "His phone is going straight to voicemail." Diana's sister Beatrice paced the length of the Persian rug, her manicured nails tapping frantically against the screen of her iPhone. "I just spoke to Mindy, the wedding planner. Dylan's groomsmen haven't seen him since the rehearsal dinner at La Venada last night." Diana kept her eyes locked on her own reflection, her posture rigidly straight. "He's just running late, Bea. You know how he gets. Probably tied up on a conference call with the Tokyo markets." "On his wedding day, Diana," Beatrice snapped, the panic bleeding through her heavy blush. "Dad is downstairs, sweating through his Bryony suit. The string quartet has played Pachelbel's Canon 4 times. People are starting to whisper." "Go downstairs," Diana ordered, her voice eerily calm, betraying none of the nausea churning in her stomach. "Tell Dad to have the servers start passing out the beluga caviar early. Buy me 15 minutes. I need a moment of peace." "Cough." Beatrice hesitated, opening her mouth to argue. But the steely look in Diana's blue eyes shut her down. 15 minutes, Diana. Then I'm calling the NYPD." The heavy oak door clicked shut, plunging the opulent suite into a suffocating silence. Diana exhaled a shaky breath, her facade crumbling the second she was alone. She closed her eyes, fighting the burning sting of tears. She didn't even love Dylan. The marriage was a calculated business arrangement orchestrated by her father to save Hastings Shipping from a looming bankruptcy. But the humiliation of being left at the altar, the scandalous headlines in tomorrow's New York Post, it would destroy her family. A faint click echoed behind her. The door had opened and closed again, the sound followed by the soft, deliberate thud of leather dress shoes on the thick carpet. Relief washed over her. "Dylan!" He had finally shown up. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" Diana asked, keeping her back turned as she stared into the mirror. She reached behind her, her fingers brushing the unzipped fabric at the small of her back. "Just zip me up, Dylan. We have an audience waiting, and my father is on the verge of a coronary." Footsteps closed the distance. The man stopped directly behind her. Diana frowned. The reflection in the mirror was obscured by the angle, but the presence behind her felt wrong. Dylan always smelled of crisp laundry and mild peppermint. The man standing behind her radiated an intense, suffocating heat, carrying the heavy, intoxicating scent of Tom Ford ombre leather, expensive whiskey, and something sharp and metallic, like ozone or fresh blood. Large, calloused hands brushed away her trembling fingers. The touch wasn't apologetic or frantic, it was possessive. The cold metal of the zipper slid up her spine, a harsh contrast to the delicate silk. She smiled, a nervous, reflexive gesture, still expecting her fiancé's familiar, soft-palmed touch. Instead, a voice dipped in gravel and dark promises brushed against her ear, the warm breath sending a violent shudder down her arms. "Your groom's not coming, little dove. I am." Diana spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. She stumbled backward, the heavy train of her Oscar de la Renta gown wrapping around her ankles. Standing in the center of the bridal suite was not Dylan Pendleton. It was Charles Moretti. He looked like a fallen angel carved from ruthless Roman marble. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored, midnight black tuxedo that emphasized the broad, predatory line of his shoulders, Charles was the terrifying kingpin of the Cosa Nostra's most powerful New York syndicate. Diana had only seen him once before, across the dimly lit dining room of the exclusive zero-star restaurant, Masa. He was a gentleman, a mechanic with man whose name was whispered in boardroom panics in federal task force meetings. His sharp jaw was shadowed by a faint 5 o'clock shadow, and a thin, pale scar cut through his left eyebrow, making his obsidian eyes look even more lethal. "What are you doing here?" Diana breathed, the blood draining from her face. Her voice trembled, though she fought to keep her chin high. "How did you get past hotel security?" Charles' lips curved into a slow, chilling smirk. "I own the security, Diana. I own the hotel manager. And as of 3 a.m. this morning, I own your fiancé." Diana's mind raced, trying to process the absolute absurdity of the situation. "Where is Dylan?" Charles stepped forward. Diana instinctively stepped back until her spine hit the edge of the antique vanity table. He didn't stop until there were mere inches between them, his towering frame forcing her to tilt her head up to meet his dead black eyes. "Dylan is currently halfway across the Atlantic on a private Gulfstream Shix 50 registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands," Charles said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the vanity beside her bridal bouquet. "He left you a parting gift, or rather, he left me one." Diana, shaking hands, reached for the envelope. She tore it open, pulling out a stack of bank statements, offshore transfer receipts, and a legally binding contract stamped with the red wax seal of the Moretti family. Her eyes scanned the documents, her stomach plummeting. "Hastings Global Shipping, $50 million. Collateral." "I don't understand," she whispered, her vision blurring. "It's quite simple, little dove," Charles murmured, reaching out. His thumb, rough and calloused, traced the line of her jaw. Diana froze, too terrified to pull away. "Your golden boy hedge fund manager is a degenerate gambler with a god complex. He lost 50 million of my syndicate's clean money in a bad real estate short in Dubai. To cover his tracks, he took a loan from me. And to secure that loan, he forged your father's signature, putting Hastings Global Shipping up as collateral." Diana gasped, the papers slipping from her hands and scattering across the floor. "That's illegal. You can't enforce a forged document. This isn't civil court, Diana." Charles laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "In my world, a debt is a debt. Dylan realized he couldn't pay me back, so he drained your father's pension funds, packed his bags, and ran. He threw you to the wolves to save his own skin." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit Diana like a physical blow. Dylan, the man who had promised her stability, the man she had sacrificed her own happiness to marry for the sake of her family's legacy, had sold them to the mafia. "My father," Diana choked out, the reality of the situation sinking its claws into her chest. "Richard Hastings was a proud man, but he was frail. His heart couldn't take this. What are you going to do to my father?" "Oh." Charles took a step back, adjusting the obsidian cufflinks on his wrists. The shift in his demeanor was instantaneous, from a predatory shadow to a calculating businessman. That depends entirely on you. Diana blinked through the unshed tears. Me. Hastings Shipping controls 3 major ports on the eastern seaboard, Charles stated, his eyes locked on hers with unblinking intensity. Ports that I need for my imports. I could kill your father today, dismantle his company, and take the ports by force. It would be messy. It would draw federal heat, but it would get the job done. He paused, letting the threat hang heavy in the floral-scented air. Or, Charles continued, his voice dropping an octave, we handled this with elegance. A merger, rather than a hostile takeover. You need a groom to save your family from public humiliation and financial ruin. I need legitimate, undisputed access to the Hastings ports, which a legal marriage to the sole heiress would provide. Diana's breath hitched. She stared at the terrifying, beautiful monster standing in her bridal suite. You're insane. You want me to marry you. I want you to walk out those double doors, take my arm and vow your life to me in front of New York's elite. Charles corrected softly. You do that, and Dylan's debt is forgiven. Your father lives out his days in the Hamptons. The Hastings legacy remains intact. You will be a Moretti, untouchable and fiercely protected. And if I say no? Charles' eyes darkened, the coldness in them absolute. Then I walk out of this room. You go downstairs and tell your father his company is gone and his life is over. My men are already stationed at the exits of the ballroom. Nobody leaves until my 50 million is settled, in blood or in business. Diana looked at the scattered papers on the floor. She thought of Dylan, miles high in the sky, sipping champagne while leaving her to face the executioner. She thought of her father, waiting downstairs, completely oblivious to the fact that a gun was practically pressed against his head. She had dressed this morning preparing to sacrifice her life to a coward. Was sacrificing it to a monster really any different? At least the monster looked her in the eye when he handed her a death sentence. A strange, freezing calm washed over Diana. The terrified, pampered heiress died in that moment, replaced by the ruthless survival instinct of a woman backed into a corner. She turned back to the mirror. Her mascara had slightly smudged. She picked up a tissue, carefully dabbing the corner of her eyes, ensuring her makeup was flawless. She adjusted the Cartier tiara, securing the pins tightly against her scalp. Through the mirror, she caught Charles watching her, a flicker of genuine surprise and dark amusement crossing his scarred face. Will you be wearing a boutonniere? Diana asked, her voice entirely stripped of its former tremor. Charles' smirk widened into a lethal, breathtaking smile. He stepped forward, offering her his arm. I think the dark suit is statement enough, don't you? Oh. But Diana turned and slipped her white-gloved hand through the crook of his arm. The muscles beneath his tailored tuxedo were hard as iron. Let's get this over with, Mr. Moretti. I believe we have a wedding to attend. They walked out of the penthouse suite together, a dark king and his captive queen, moving silently down the plush, carpeted corridors toward the grand staircase. As they reached the top of the stairs, Diana looked down at the massive, gilded doors of the ballroom. She could hear the anxious murmur of the crowd, the frantic whispers of her father. Charles raised a hand, snapping his fingers once. 2 massive men in identical dark suits, standing guard by the doors, immediately grabbed the brass handles and pulled them open. The murmuring in the ballroom instantly died. 300 faces turned toward the staircase. Down below, Richard Hastings' face morphed from anxious relief to absolute, paralyzing horror as he registered the man walking his daughter down the aisle. The string quartet fumbled, the cellist dragging a harsh, screeching note across the strings before dropping his bow entirely. Diana kept her chin high, her grip tightening on Charles' arm as they descended the marble steps. The silence in the room was deafening, suffocating. Charles didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes fixed forward, leading her straight to the altar where an utterly bewildered priest stood, clutching his Bible as if it were a shield. Charles stopped at the altar, turning Diana to face him. He looked over his shoulder at the paralyzed crowd, his dark eyes locking onto Richard Hastings, who was visibly trembling in the front row. "Lock the doors," Charles commanded, his voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous silent room. The heavy gilded doors slammed shut with a terrifying finality, the metallic click of the dead bolts echoing like gunshots. Charles turned his attention back to the trembling priest. "Dearly beloved," Charles whispered, a wicked, triumphant gleam in his eye. "Proceed." Father Thomas was a man who had delivered sermons to governors and baptized the children of tech billionaires. But as he stared into the dead, obsidian eyes of Charles Moretti, the elderly priest looked as though he might faint. "Proceed," the priest stammered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the gold-leafed edges of his Bible. "The vows, Father," Charles instructed smoothly, his voice a low, terrifying purr that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the Pierre's grand ballroom. "We don't want to keep the guests waiting." In the front row, Richard Hastings finally broke out of his paralysis. His face was an alarming shade of crimson. "Diana, what the hell is going on? Security. Where is Dylan?" Richard lunged forward, but before his custom John Lobb Oxfords could hit the second step of the altar, a towering man in a charcoal suit stepped out from the shadows of the floral arch. It was Matteo, Charles's underboss. Matteo didn't say a word. He simply unbuttoned his suit jacket, casually revealing the brushed steel grip of a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol tucked into his waistband. Richard froze, the breath leaving his lungs in a wheeze. "Dad, stop," Diana commanded. Her voice was shockingly steady, slicing through the rising panic in the room like a silver blade. She looked down at her father, her blue eyes pleading but firm. "Sit down. Do not say another word. This is a corporate merger, Dad, nothing more." "A merger?" Beatrice shrieked from the bridesmaid lineup, her face buried in a bouquet of white orchids. "Diana, that's the head of the Cosa Nostra. I said sit down, Bea." Diana snapped, the authority of a true Hastings heiress finally bleeding into her tone. Charles watched her, a flicker of genuine respect lighting up the dark abyss of his eyes. He turned his attention back to the trembling priest. "You heard, my bride. Red." The ceremony was a surreal, terrifying blur. There were no tears of joy, no romantic sighs. Only the heavy, suffocating weight of 300 hostages masquerading as wedding guests. When Father Thomas finally reached the exchange of rings, Charles reached into his pocket. He didn't have Dylan's platinum Tiffany band. Instead, he slid a heavy antique gold ring onto Diana's trembling finger. A massive blood-red ruby sat in the center, flanked by diamonds the Moretti family crest. It felt heavy, like a shackle. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Father Thomas whispered rapidly, skipping the preamble. You may kiss the bride." Diana braced herself, expecting a brutal display of dominance. But as Charles cupped her jaw, his touch was surprisingly gentle. His lips met hers firm, warm, and tasting of expensive scotch. It wasn't a violent assault. It was a brand, a message to every soul in that room that Diana Hastings was now untouchable property of the underworld. When he pulled away, he turned to the terrified crowd. "The bar is open. Drink. Eat the beluga caviar. Celebrate the union of Hastings and Moretti. Anyone who attempts to leave before the cake is cut will have a very brief, very unpleasant conversation with my men in the lobby." The reception that followed was a macabre masterpiece. Waiters from Daniel Boulud's premier catering service moved like frightened ghosts, pouring Dom Perignon Vintage 2012 with shaking hands. The string quartet, having recovered their wits under the watchful eye of armed guards, played a haunting, slow rendition of Vivaldi. Charles pulled Diana onto the polished mahogany dance floor for their first dance. She felt the eyes of New York's elite burning into her back pity, horror, and morbid fascination. "You're shaking, little dove," Charles murmured, pulling her flush against his chest. His hand rested firmly on the small of her back, right over the zipper he had secured an hour prior. "I'm dancing with a cartel boss while my family is held hostage. My wedding reception," Diana hissed under her breath, keeping a stiff smile plastered on her face for the cameras snapping from the sidelines. "Forgive me if I don't have the rhythm. You think I'm the villain in this story, Diana," Charles said softly, spinning her effortlessly. The heavy silk of her Oscar de la Renta gown flared around them. "You think Dylan was just a coward who ran with the money?" Diana stiffened. "I saw the offshore receipts. He stole your money and left me to pay the price." "He did worse than that," Charles corrected, leaning in until his lips brushed her earlobe. "Dylan knew my syndicate would come for the ports once he defaulted, but he wanted extra insurance, so he sold your itinerary to the Rossi family." Diana's heart skipped a beat. The Rossis were a brutal rival faction based out of New Jersey, known for human trafficking and extortion. "They were waiting at JFK," Charles continued smoothly, dipping her backward, ensuring the crowd saw a perfect, romantic tableau. "Dylan sold you to them to wipe clean a separate debt he owed from a botched casino deal in Atlantic City. The plan was to abduct you on your way to the airport for your honeymoon in Bora Bora. You would have vanished, Diana, shipped in a crate to Palermo by midnight." Diana gasped, stumbling slightly as Charles pulled her back up. "I intercepted Dylan's Gulfstream," Charles whispered, his eyes locking onto hers, devoid of any deception. "I have his money, and I have his confession. I stepped into this wedding to secure my ports, yes. But I also stepped in because I don't let scum like Dylan Pendleton sell women to the Rossis on my watch. You belong to me now, and no one touches what is mine." The blacked-out Maybach 62 glided silently up the winding gravel driveway of Charles's private compound on Meadow Lane in Southampton. The estate was a sprawling, modern fortress of glass and black steel, bordered by the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean on one side and a 15-foot security wall on the other. Diana stepped out of the vehicle, the cool ocean breeze whipping at the hem of her reception dress, a sleek white Tom Ford sheath dress she had changed into before leaving the pier. The drive from Manhattan had been spent in total silence. Diana's mind was spinning, piecing together the shattered fragments of her reality. Dylan had tried to sell her. Charles had saved her, but enslaved her in the process. Charles let her past the biometric security scanners and heavily armed guards patrolling the perimeter. They entered the master suite, a cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the moonlit ocean. A massive, king-sized bed dominated the center of the room, covered in dark silk sheets. Charles warped over to a crystal decanter on a floating marble shelf, pouring 2 glasses of Macallan 25. He offered her one. Diana ignored the glass. Instead, she walked over to her bridal overnight bag, a vintage Hermes Kelly bag her mother had given her. She unclasped the gold hardware, reaching into the silk lining. "I won't force you into that bed, Diana," Charles said, his tone flat as he took a sip of his scotch. "The marriage was for legal leverage and the ports. As long as you play the dutiful wife in public, your private life remains your own. You have a suite down the hall. That's very chivalrous of a mafia don," Diana replied, turning around. In her hand, she held a small black velvet pouch. "But I'm not here to discuss sleeping arrangements, Charles. I'm here to discuss business." Charles raised an eyebrow, leaning against the marble counter. "Business? You think you hold all the cards because you saved my life and absorbed my father's debt, Diana said, her voice dropping the facade of the frightened bride. She walked slowly toward him, the heels of her Jimmy Choos clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. But you underestimated me, just like Dylan did. She tossed the velvet pouch onto the counter next to his scotch. Open it, she demanded. Charles' eyes narrowed slightly. He set his glass down, picked up the pouch, and pulled out a sleek, encrypted titanium USB drive. What is this? 3 days ago, Diana began, crossing her arms over her chest. I went to Dylan's office in the Chrysler Building to surprise him for lunch. He wasn't there, but his safe was left ajar. Dylan was always careless with his combination. It was my birthday. Inside, I found the forged collateral documents for Hastings shipping. I saw the transfer receipts to Dubai. Charles froze, the titanium drive resting in his palm. You knew he was stealing from your father, and you still walked down that aisle today. Hastings Global Shipping was bleeding out, Charles, Diana said, her blue eyes flashing with a cold, calculating light that mirrored his own. The board was preparing to oust my father. If Dylan absconded with the money, the federal insurance policies would trigger. The corporate write-offs would save the company from bankruptcy, and my father could retire a victim rather than a failure. I was playing the martyr bride to give my family an out. Charles stared at her, genuinely stunned. You were going to let him ruin his own life to save your father's empire? Yes, Diana admitted, taking a step closer, but I didn't know about his debt to you when I certainly didn't know about his side deal with the Rosses. That was a miscalculation on my part. However, before I left his office, I copied his entire hard drive onto that USB. She tapped the titanium drive in Charles' hand. That drive contains the routing numbers to Dylan's offshore Cayman accounts, Diana whispered, looking up into his scarred, handsome face. Not just the $50 million he owes you, but the remaining $200 million he's embezzled from his hedge fund over the last 5 years. The FBI doesn't have it. His partners don't have it. Only I do. A slow, predatory smile spread across Charles' face. The amusement in his eyes was replaced by a burning, intense fascination. You stole the thief's master ledger. I did, Diana said, lifting a chin. You want the Hastings ports. You have them. You want the legitimate cover of a high society wife. You have it. But I am not a hostage, Charles. And I am not a pawn. What do you want, Diana? He asked, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. I want 50% of Dylan's hidden $200 million, she stated firmly. I want full operational control of the Hastings ports on paper, meaning your men answer to me when they move cargo. And if the Rosses ever step foot in New York again, I want you to burn them to the ground. Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Charles looked at the beautiful, terrifying woman standing before him in a white dress, realizing he hadn't married a delicate dove at all. He had married a viper. He slowly reached out, his calloused fingers tracing a line of her throat, feeling the steady, fearless pulse beneath her skin. You're a very dangerous woman, Mrs. Moretti, Charles murmured, the title rolling off his tongue with a newfound reverence. Diana didn't flinch. She leaned slightly into his touch, a dark, victorious smile playing on her lips. You haven't seen anything yet, husband. Diana didn't just survive the Mafia, she hijacked the entire syndicate. Talk about the ultimate power couple. Do you think Diana went too far, or did she play the perfect hand to become the queen of the underworld? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.